Okay, it's a little bright here, but it's just me and this tree. And we're going on about the law of entropy, second law of thermodynamics. We're at BibleStudyMatters.net, K71. We're looking at eigen. Compare quotations from Dr. Don Patton's notes. He's a geologist and has done lots of research on this. And he's investigating the second law of thermodynamics. So Eigen, a Nobel laureate, wrote in a book called Evolution that he wrote, here at the molecular level are the roots of the old puzzle about the chicken or the egg. Which came first, function or information? As we shall show, neither one could precede the other. They had to evolve together. Information. Interesting. By Peter T. Mora, National Institute of Health, Nature, Volume 199, crystallization occurs because it leads to the lowest energy state and to the most stable arrangement of atoms or molecules under the given conditions. Crystallization leads to simple, very uniform repeating structures, which are inert. These structures do not function and are not designed by function. All right. A little uncomfortable about history. Richard Morris, Time's Arrows. For example, when a crystal grows and a liquid structure appears, there's nothing present before the process of crystallization began. As the crystal becomes larger, the entropy of the system does increase. The appearance of structure does not always imply an increase in order, even though structure and order are equated in our everyday speech. The second law applies, therefore, to life forms, thus ruling out evolution. So Dr. Don Patton, in his excellent research, goes on to say, information degenerates, deteriorates, according to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, to produce a living organism like a properly functioning eye, you must have extra energy, but you need more than that. That's an insufficient answer. Now we're told that you have extra energy from the sun. We grant that, but there's another question. The other requirement is information. While energy comes from the sun, I ask, where does the information come from? But some claim that the information came from the sun along with the energy. Now I don't know of information, certainly not the kind of information that would define the human eye riding on sunbeams. Where's the information for hemoglobin? Or the information that the simplest cell equivalent to thousands of copies of Encyclopedia Britannica on a sunbeam? Where did the sun give us this information? Information doesn't come on sunbeams. Naturally, information deteriorates. Yet we see tremendous amounts of information even in the simplest cell. Consider the statement by Harold Blum in his book Time's Arrow and Evolution. He says, no matter how carefully we examine the energies of living systems, we find no evidence of defeat of thermodynamic principles, the entropy, but we do encounter a degree of complexity not witnessed in the non-living world. In other words, it applies to life just as well as non-life. The only difference is that when we get to living systems, we find that which is more complex, but it follows the same law of thermodynamics. Here, Ila Prigogine, a Nobel laureate as well, physics today. Unfortunately, this principle cannot explain the formation of biological structures. They evolve. We don't know how. The probability that at ordinary temperatures a macroscopic number of molecules is assembled to give rise to the highly ordered structures and to the coordinated functions characterizing living organisms is vanishingly small. There is no evidence. The idea of spontaneous genesis of life in its present form is therefore highly improbable, even on the scale of billions of years during which prebiotic evolution occurred. So he admits it occurred. He just says it's impossible at the same time. If I try to talk out of both sides of my mouth, I'd crack my teeth. Sidney Fox, talking about the origin of life, states, evolution, however, has put together the smallest components. It has proceeded from the simple to the complex. Really. Chemical and engineering news. Now he is one of the leading experts in the world on the origin of life. Obviously, in order to get this simple cell with information content equivalent to thousands of copies of the sets of encyclopedias, you've got to have a procedure from the simple to the complex. And yet, in terms of information content, We know that the second law says that it goes the other way. But to get that simple cell, Sidney Fox says, you've got to proceed the other way. Well, how do you do that naturally? We've got high extra energy from the sun, but where does the extra energy come from? From natural processes. That's impossible. We see illustration of the second law of thermodynamics throughout the living world, which we are looking at the simplest cell, or whether we are looking at anything else in the universe. Consider the statement that's made by Theodosus Dobzhansky as he illustrates in the living world the implications of this second law. Here he is talking about mutations, which ironically are supposed to be the explanation of the onward and upward process of evolution. And he says the harmfulness of most mutants is just what we could be reasonably expected. In other words, he is saying something that goes wrong and produces harm. And that's how evolution occurred? Yeah, maybe mankind produced harm to the ape. I don't know. An accident, he says, a random change in any delicate mechanism can hardly be expected to improve it. He says poking a stick into the machinery of one's watch or into one's radio set can hardly be expected to make it work better. No, we have a random change that sometimes occurs in the hereditary process that's defined as a mutation. It produces harm. It doesn't produce onward and upward processes as he would simply from this statement. He continues defining this phenomenon, saying, one can say that mutations are owing to incorrect copying, to occasional mistakes in the generally so remarkable accurate process of replication. You may, if you wish, compare mutations to accidental misspellings or misprints, which even the most experienced copyist makes from time to time. So that's what he says. I wouldn't understand his book because he keeps contradicting himself every other statement he makes. So mutations then are supposed to be the raw material from which we get this procedure upward to produce evolution. And yet it's rather better described as an illustration of this second law in living processes that produce deterioration and disorder and disorganization. That's what the law predicts, and that's what we observe. Stephen Gould has acknowledged that's what we see indicated in the fossil record about the history of life in this world. He says, I'll say it once more. Maximal diversity of structural design, right at the beginning with the late history of life, being a story of reduction of the initial maximal diversity by the extension and loss of most of the lineage and failure of any survivors ever again to generate fundamental new designs. That's why they keep making big, big words out of simple things, and then they explain the words opposite to what we observe. At the beginning of the history of life, Stephen Gould says, we have every major design right from the start. Wow. And from that point, you don't get an increase in complexity. You get increasing order. You don't get increasing order. You have, as he said, a reduction through extinction and a failure ever again. He says, to generate new designs. You have fewer phyla, fewer major organizational structural designs now than you had at the beginning. It has deteriorated and degenerated according to the principles of entropy. Gene Rostron, the Orion Book of Evolution. No, decidedly, I cannot make myself think that this slips mutations of heredity and have been able, even with the cooperation of natural selection, even with the advantage of the immense periods of time in which evolution works on life, to build the entire world, with its structural prodigality and refinements, its astonishing adaptations. I cannot persuade myself to think that the eye, the ear, the human brain have been formed in this way. Wow. And he wrote that. We're reminded that the evolutionist represents this kind of change typically as a change from the small to the large. We look at time-life's representation of the evolution of man, and it begins with a small monkey-like creature, the gibbon, which they acknowledge has nothing to do with the evolution of man. But he's in the chart. That leads to larger and still larger. Finally, on up to the tallest amount a modern man, you look in the biology textbook and you see a little Ehopius, the horse, leading up to the next size, and then the next size, and finally up to the modern horse of today. And if evolution is true, then this is the kind of thing that we should see represented in the fossil record, but this is not the case. The second law of thermodynamics predicts a downward deteriorative procedure that we see illustrated. And what we do actually see in the fossil record is perfectly consistent with that second law. Notice the statement that's made in geology text, that's made by Von Englund and Castor regarding the nature of life in the past. He says, mammalian life was richer in kinds of larger sizes and had an abundant expression in the Pliocene than in later times. They report what they see and then they contradict it in the textbooks. It was bigger in the past than there were more kinds. There are fewer kinds today. This reminds us of Gould's statement that when we began, we had all the major kinds. We hadn't produced any new kinds once since, and it has deteriorated since then. And that's true also regarding size. Consider the statement in Time magazine regarding Richard Leakey's work in Africa. It says that Leakey has been scourging the gorge since 1931. Over the years, he's unearthed the bones of an ancient pig as big as a rhino, a 6-foot-tall sheep, a 12-foot-tall bird, and the flat-topped skull of the erect nutcracker man. There are things that were bigger, sheep and birds and rhinos, and that's just scratching the surface. That's typical of what we find in the fossil record rather than the other way around, which is the way it is generally represented in the textbooks. The horse chart showing an increase in size is in virtually every biology textbook, but we see a donkey, Equus giganticus, that was unearthed near Lubbock, Texas, and this was a donkey that would have been about 9 feet tall at the shoulder. A donkey. That certainly would mess the horse charts up, and so they conveniently leave it out, and they do most of the information on relative size. A bison in the past that would have been about 12 feet tall at the shoulder that has a horn span of almost 12 feet, much, much larger than the bison that we observe today. Again, we don't see that in the charts that are represented in the textbooks. In the fossil record, the armadillo was much larger. In fact, 9 times larger than the present-day armadillo. And when we look at the various creatures in the fossil record, invariably they were larger in the past. We see a fossil turtle that was found in San Antonio, almost identical to modern-day turtles, except that it was 12 to 14 feet across. We look at it, crocodiles, as they appeared in the fossil record, compared to modern crocodiles. The fossil crocodile was some 50 feet long, compared with around the countryside in the fossil record that they were about 60 feet tall, the cone being somewhat between 6 and 10 feet tall. And this is a very common fossil that we see everywhere. A dragonfly fossil with a wingspan of over 30 inches. That's typical of the fossils that we find in the fossil record. That's not an exception. More on this next time.